The Byte Show is listener-supported at thebyteshow.com.
Hello, everybody. This is GeorgeAnn Hughes, and this is The Byte Show. And we're blessed to have Joseph P. Farrell with us. Joseph is an exquisite researcher and very prolific writer. He has numerous books out, and please go to his website and purchase them through his website. And tonight we're going to add to our social engineering file, magic of social engineering.
We hope we're going to add to it.
Yeah. Yeah. Joseph, there are new technologies that they're coming out with that promise to read your thoughts.
Right.
That just, it's amazing stuff.
Well, it really is, and I wanted to mention something in kind of in the answer that I just heard from the publisher of Genes, Giants, Monsters, and Men.
Oh.
And my answer is kind of predicated on some of the material that's in that book, so I want to make a little announcement about that book. I just heard from them, as I mentioned, and we received the galley proofs on Monday night, and we got all of those corrected, so that will be going off to the printer this week. And the owner of Farrell House told me that he's looking to have the book out sometime, hopefully, in early April. And what that means is, for all of you who've been waiting very patiently, including me,
yes, me too,
for that book, I appreciate everyone's patience. It will take about 2 to 3 weeks for the book, once the publisher has it, to make it from there into Amazon and into the stores. So for those of you who've been ordering the book off my website, it will be about 2 to 3 weeks after the publisher tells me that they have it, and I will post a notice for everybody up on my website once I actually have the book in hand, so that they can kind of be on the lookout for it. But anyway, I do write in that book, in the 3rd chapter of that book, about the technologies and incidentally the techniques of mind manipulation and social engineering. And you mentioned in your question that they have machines now that read people's minds. And what we have to understand is we go back to the 1950s when the intelligence agencies, particularly in this country, began to experiment with abilities, with technologies, with techniques of engineering individual human consciousness.
Yeah.
And of course, at that time, there were a variety of technologies and techniques, and also something I like to call combinations. In other words, there were those who were seeking, through a blend both of technologies and techniques, to manipulate people's consciousness. In other words, they would use LSD. Those are very famous experiments that were done under the MK Ultra program, in conjunction with hypnosis and things of this sort, to try and engineer responses of individuals to signals and so on and so forth. Well, one of the things I point out in Genes, Giants, Monsters, and Men in a very cursory way in the 3rd chapter in that book, and incidentally, we'll get to that chapter later, I'm sure, but one of the things I attempt to do is to show how very, very far that technology has been advanced since the 1950s, and largely that's because neurophysiology itself has advanced to a great degree. They now know very localized areas in the brain that are normally responsible for certain things that human beings think, certain things that they feel, and so on and so forth. So if you know how to target the brain in those particular areas with an appropriate technology, then you can pretty much manipulate their thought. Now, one of the technologies that I discuss in Genes, Giants, Monsters, and Men is precisely the patents that have come out that do mention that they now have the ability remotely to, with very sensitive equipment, to read the alpha, the beta, and the theta brainwave patterns of an individual. And they have the science perfected to the point that they can tell simply by reading an electroencephalogram the basic emotional state of an individual. Of course, they can't actually get down to the point of what someone is thinking, at least not so far as we've been told publicly. But we have to understand that technologies that we're aware of and what's actually in existence, there's a lag time, oftentimes some people say of about 20 to 30 years. So who knows, what actually exists in the arsenals of some of these intelligence agencies. And of course, the other thing I want to stress, GeorgeAnn, is we tend to look solely at the intelligence agencies in the United States as having conducted this activity, but the former Soviet Union and certainly Russia, since the collapse of the Soviet Union, has continued a lot of that research, and we would have to assume that, the Chinese have done so, that the French, that the English, that the Germans, the Italians, basically anybody else that has money to spend and intelligence agencies to spend it on, is doing work along similar lines. But yes, that technology has been around. It does exist, and it's very, very disturbing, because if, of course, you can read someone's emotional state, then of course you can reverse the technology and actually. And I discuss this in Genes, Giants, Monsters, and Men. You can also have a technology where you train the brain to frequencies that are in the alpha, beta, and theta brainwave frequencies, and train information on those frequencies. And it is now possible. In fact, I talk about this in that third chapter of Genes, Giants, Monsters, and Men, where a neurophysiologist up in Canada successfully invented a device that looks kind of like a motorcycle helmet. You put this thing on your head, and it beams frequencies in those brainwave patterns into your head, and it's to the point of development that they can actually beam music, specific music, into people's brains, that they can beam actual voices. In other words, you can create the illusion, GeorgeAnn, with this technology, that you're hearing the voice of God, that you're hearing, departed loved ones, that you are having visions. In other words, they can manipulate all of this now, and that's the key thing here, because now, when we've said that, we've opened a Pandora's box that technologies can be used to create illusory, mystical, or even religious experiences, and even to a certain extent to create religious revelations, if you want. So what I do in that third chapter of Genes, Giants, Monsters, and Men is I take the modern technology and I go back and I look at religious texts and to see if we have traces or indications of technologies or techniques of mind manipulation and social engineering taking place in some of those texts. And of course, that's very controversial, and like I say, there's going to be a lot of unhappy people. But I'm doing that not so much to attack anyone's faith or religion. I'm simply doing so to raise the point that these are issues that religious apologetics is going to have to deal with, and deal with increasingly and in an effective manner. I don't think the same stock, Sunday school theological answers are going to work much longer, because this technology is advancing so quickly. And in many cases, it does bear resemblance to things that you read about in ancient texts, and that's the disturbing thing.
Well, I go back to the Iraq War, number one, where the soldiers, a bunch of Iraqi soldiers, just literally threw down their arms
and surrendered,
and said that Allah told them to.
Yeah,
you know?
and this is a very good point that you make. It's an extremely important point that you make, because we did have technologies to do this back during the Operation Desert Storm, the first Gulf War. And as far as I am aware, that technology was deployed and was used. And so, yes, you do have the potential, and I hope people understand the importance of the point that you raised. You do have the potential to not only use this technology against an individual, but against a whole population. And in this case, of course, what you are doing is a clear case of social engineering by technological means. You are creating a pattern, as we talked about in some of the previous sessions. Mm-hmm. You're creating a pattern or a grid of perception on the part of people. And, of course, once you distort people's perceptions, you are also interfering with their decision-making processes and guiding them to make certain decisions. And this is exactly what happened in that instance.
Yes. Well, I look at what's going on over in Egypt and Libya, Tunisia, Bahrain.
Uh-huh.
My gosh.
Wisconsin.
yeah, Wisconsin. And it just seems like, I can't help but wonder if some of this technology is being used to evoke these responses from people.
Well, now, you're forcing me to open a Pandora's box and to talk about books that aren't even finished yet.
Oh, dear. Oh, my gosh. Oh, Joseph.
Yes, my initial response to that question, and when all of these uprisings began to occur, mm-hmm. one of the things that I immediately thought of was there might be some very large-scale social engineering taking place via technologies, via techniques of engineering consciousness. But now here's the rub, GeorgeAnn, and this is about as far as I'm going to pry the lid off of the box that you're trying to get into. Not all of those technologies may be modern. Because if you look at the modern technologies of mind manipulation, many of them are reliant upon the use of very peculiar properties of piezoelectric effects. And piezoelectric effects are, of course, the electrical effects that are generated in rocks, in stone, that are under stress of some sort, all right? Mm-hmm. In other words, if you take a little quartz crystal and put it in a hydraulic press and smash it, well, as the quartz crystal is being smashed, it'll give off little sparks of electricity, because there's electricity locked up in the lattice work of crystals. Yes. Well, they have discovered that they can use some of these piezoelectric effects in manipulating consciousness. Oh. And the thing that we have to remember is, of course, particularly in Egypt, you've got a lot of great big crystals in the form of pyramids squatting all over the landscape there. Yeah. So, it may be that we're looking at an example of the consciousness effects of these structures in the region being activated for whatever reason. And, I've been maintaining since the Giza Death Star series and the Cosmic War, that this physics has an immediate interface with consciousness, mm-hmm. and that these structures and some of this ancient technology appears to have been linked somehow, very directly, in a very direct fashion, to manipulations of consciousness and vice versa, that consciousness, as we've talked about previously in this series, is
with the templates.
Yes, with the templates, exactly.
Yeah.
That it is possible for consciousness to have a direct effect on the physical medium, and in groups particularly. So I think we have to remain open to the speculative possibility that we are looking not only at the potential of modern technology and techniques being used here, but something else I think may be going on, and I underline the word may be going on.
Yes.
In that some of these ancient technologies in these regions are perhaps reactivating. Now, the other interesting thing to note, and I think Mr. Hoagland has even pointed this out in a couple of his recent interviews, is that if you look at the spread of those uprisings in the Middle East and plot them on a map, they're curiously coincidental to certain places on the world grid. So, even Wisconsin. Something is going on, and I don't think, my guess is, I don't think the elite or elites that think that they run the world are entirely in charge of all of it.
Yes, I agree. It's just amazing.
Yes, it is. Particularly in the case of Egypt, where you had a puppet dictator essentially that had been propped up for so long by that hidden Anglo-American elite. Because we have to remember that regime basically is the successor to Gamal Abdel Nasser, and of course he was brought into power through a CIA-sponsored coup that overthrew King Farouk, and the people running the coup on the ground, let's not forget, were a bunch of Nazis.
Yeah.
So you can hardly blame the Egyptians for wanting to get rid of that regime. So something very definitely is at work, and I find it very interesting that it appears to have also signaled a change in basic foreign policy on the part of the Obama administration. Now they're telling Gaddafi just to go, just get out of there. So it's going to be an interesting time. But I do think we have to hold open the distinct possibility that we're looking at the possible application of some of these technologies.
Oh my gosh! Oh.
Yeah, it's very, very interesting. It's the field is. The field of technological mind manipulation seems just like the purest science fiction, GeorgeAnn.
Yes.
And, the problem there is, and I've discussed another technology in Genes, Giants, Monsters, Men called EDOM, E-D-O-M. It stands for the electronic dissolution of memory. In other words, through electromagnetic means, you induce specific amnesias of particular long-term memory areas of a given brain.
Oh my gosh!
So, in other words, you even have a possibility here, GeorgeAnn, of the technological rationalization for the abduction phenomenon that many people in ufology talk about.
Yes.
They're abducted and they experience some form of missing time, missing memory, and so on. And oftentimes that can only be reconstructed, which is a very iffy process to begin with through hypnotic regression. So you even have, in this case, the possibility that if applied en masse, you would have a possibility to engineer a whole collective group's memory or manipulate their history in that sense. So, we're looking at something very, very big. And, of course, when you start thinking again of these technologies and then looking at certain ancient texts and the parallels and the techniques, that are used also for social engineering, it's rather breathtaking.
Wow.
Yeah.
Well, tonight I was watching Anderson Cooper 360.
Yes.
And over 100,000 people have gone into Tunisia.
Yes.
It's amazing. They are fleeing Libya.
Uh-huh.
The concerns are medicine, food,
yes.
tents, basic
just basic human necessities.
Yes.
Well, Gaddafi's always been a brutal man, and again, you can hardly blame the Libyans for
yes.
for wanting to get. So, in other words, I'm certainly not writing off everything to technology or to possible techniques in play. But the problem is, of course, anytime you have uprisings like this, you've always got people lurking in the background trying to channel things in a particular direction, and that's what concerns me here. And if there is technology or techniques in play in these uprisings, I think the long term will show who might have been using them. I don't think the short term we're in a position to say yet if they are being used, and if they are, then to what end.
My goodness, Joseph, the technology, I've asked you numerous times, about the book of Revelation.
Yes.
And that most, if not all, of the things in that book could be carried out by using technology.
Well, we have to understand there that the book of Revelation, and you know me, I'm not given to much commentary on religious or theological matters in a direct manner.
Yes.
But within Christianity, there has, particularly in this country, in North America, in the United States and Canada, and with what people think is historical Christianity, which bears no resemblance to it whatsoever. Mm-hmm. But, of course, there is a whole doctrine, there's a whole school of thought of what's supposed to happen and when during the end times.
Yes.
And of course, that division of theology is called eschatology, from the Greek meaning the last things. In other words, it's the doctrine of the last things.
Yes.
All right. A particular perception, in my opinion, was created of what was supposed to happen and in what sequence and how and who would be behind it. So in other words, you had the application, in my opinion, of a creation of expectation, a creation of a perception about this particular area of doctrine that has become so widespread that people think that it is the doctrine of historical Christianity, which it is not. The doctrine, the rapture, the two-stage second coming of Christ, the tribulation, all of that stuff that you hear about from certain authors whose names I won't mention.
Yes.
All of that is the creation of a perception that really began, to a certain extent, in full force in the 19th century with the Schofield Reference Bible and the Irvingites in England and so on and so forth. The Jehovah's Witnesses in this country certainly had a large part to play in the creation of some of that, and to a certain extent there were precursors of this whole school of thinking about the last things in the Middle Ages with a fellow by the name of Joachim of Fiore. But my point here is that first someone has, over the last century and a half at least, if not longer, has carefully staged or created an interpretation of last things, and in particular the book of Revelation, that do not necessarily fall from the book itself. In other words, when anyone, from that school of thought comes to me and says, well, do you believe this about that and what it says in Revelation, what they're doing is they're applying a tradition of interpretation that they're bringing to the text, and not necessarily anything that they're getting directly from it. All right?
Right.
So once you've created a particular perception of interpretation, which in itself is not historically based, you won't find the doctrine of the rapture. You won't find the two-stage second coming of Christ in the early church fathers. That's the problem. So once you've created this doctrine, then you're in a perfect position, having set up a false interpretation, to set up a false fulfillment of it.
Oh, yes.
And to do so by technological means. And that's what disturbs me about the current situation with so many people, not just within Christianity, but within Islam, expecting certain apocalyptic events according to interpretations of their sacred texts that have actually been championed and put out there very carefully over a number of years.
Oh yes.
So I find that aspect of things very, very disturbing, and that is classical social engineering.
Oh yes, it is. It's like the business of you'll burn in hell. Don't we have writings, letters that were preserved that they held on to this hell thing in order to control the people?
Well, you've always had, and this is something that I begin to pry the lid open in Genes, Giants, Monsters, and Men. You've always had, in my opinion, a very hidden power elite behind the manipulation of a lot of religious texts and of a lot of religions.
Oh, yes.
And this is one reason that people get very frustrated with me, because I'm not attempting to do theology in any of my books, but I am attempting to make people aware of the issues for religious apologetics that arise when you approach those texts in that fashion. But, it's up to every individual to figure out how or what their response to them should be. And that's the reason I avoid theology, because, my response to those questions is going to be different than a Baptist's response or a Lutheran's response or a Roman Catholic's response. I certainly can't speak for those churches, nor would I presume to.
Yeah.
So, that's the reason I raised the issue. But if you look at, and again, I should add to what I just said, the book I'm writing now goes into other aspects of that whole manipulation of human emotion and human consciousness through the application of religious terror. All right, and it's not necessarily in the form of Islam or Christianity or Judaism that I'm talking about now in the book that I'm writing now, but it's an element that you find in all religions at some point. The question becomes where does this element come from and when?
Yes.
That's very crucial. That when question is very crucial, because in my own personal reading of things, my own opinion, as I'm looking at different religions and cosmologies and so on, it appears that you have two layers, two groups at work, and this goes back to something that I kind of hinted at in the Giza Death Star series and again in the Cosmic War, that you have two surviving elites from that war, a good one, essentially, put quotes around good, and a bad one, put quotes around bad.
Right.
And for a while they make common cause simply to survive. But you also have to bear in mind that you've got two different ideologies and two different agendas and people with more or less moral scruples willing to put those into practice. Now, the interesting thing is if you examine certain religions, you'll discover that this use of terror is something that emerges later. It's not part of the original, so to speak, it's not part of the original foundational cosmological view. So I think you have to take a very, very high overview. You have to look at things from a very long-range perspective in order to see these things take place. What I'm simply trying to do is make people aware of some potential problems with traditional approaches to texts and these types of questions, and suggest, and I underline again the word suggest, that there may be other things in play than the standard pious explanations would like to give.
Very interesting.
It's very interesting, and again, I hesitate even saying as much as I did, but I can't say more and in detail because I'm writing about that particular topic at some length in the book I'm writing now, and in connection with, again, some of these technological things and implications and some of the physics implications that all of this spells out.
I didn't know that.
Oh yeah, well that's what I'm doing.
Oh my goodness, Joseph! I was not aware of that, or I wouldn't have asked you those questions.
No, that's okay. That's okay. You've asked questions that have tied into books that I've been writing before, and I've done my tap dance and song and dance and pried open the lid a little bit and let people peer into a little bit of the box. But there's so much, GeorgeAnn. There's so much to be said about all these topics, and even with as much as I'm writing, I can assure you I'm only scratching the surface.
Yes. And when you read your books, they seem so deep, and yet to think that you're only scratching the surface, it's like, oh my God, what else is there?
There's so much. Just this one issue of possible agendas at work behind religions and texts. Well, the biblical critics of the 18th and 19th centuries long suspected that there were editorial agendas, major ones, at work in the Old Testament.
Yes.
Well, I think that's true. I don't happen to think that their reconstructions of the agendas were all that good, but I do think that they were onto something. But I think that the real problem is if we look at any texts like that, particularly from that region, it doesn't have to be biblical. It can be, Sumerian. It can be Babylonian. It can be Akkadian, Egyptian. I think you're looking at the definite possibility that you have hidden players that are in control of those texts, and they want to manipulate those texts for a particular reason, and the reason is usually to do some form of social engineering.
Well, maybe that's why Jesus Christ spoke of learning from the Holy Spirit.
Well, this is one of the things that the early Gnostics pointed out in their approach to the Old Testament and to the New, is that for them, of course, there was a definite and distinctive moral break between the two.
Yes.
And they would point to statements in the Gospels, where Christ says, you are of your father the devil, and he was a liar and murderer from the beginning.
Yes.
Well, it was on the basis of that and similar expressions that the Gnostics believed that you could not tie Christ to the God of the Old Testament at all.
Yeah.
So, there's all sorts of theological issues in play. But my point in raising the technological issues is to show that if we grant the proposition that there are technologies potentially in play, then we also have to grant the possibility that there are elites who are using those technologies that are in play, and that's the rub.
Oh yeah. Oh my gosh.
Yeah, that's a big oh my gosh.
It certainly is. I mean, what group would you hang that on?
Well, again, my model, what I've been doing with the last few books, beginning with The Philosopher's Stone, continuing on into Babylon's Banksters, continuing now into Gene's Giants, Monsters, and Men, and then the book that I'm writing now, is I've been basically applying that very, very simple model that you have at least two ideological groups, if you wish, or elites, if you want to call them that, or if you want to follow the esoteric tradition, the White Brotherhood and the Black Brotherhood. It goes under a variety of names. But my point in using this model is to suggest that these groups that survived the Cosmic War are analogous rather to the Anglo-American elite and the Nazis after World War II, because they both constituted elites, and they both made common cause for a while, as I suggest in Babylon's Banksters. So I'm suggesting that this model, this idea of surviving post-war elites after the Cosmic War, is really the basis or foundation for the esoteric tradition that there are two brotherhoods, all right?
Yes.
So what I've been doing in my books is simply applying that model and seeing if on that basis we get a different reading of texts, and of course you do, and it's a rather shocking one once you apply that standard. And it, like I say, it raises massive questions for religious apologetics, and it raises equally massive questions as to just what the extent of the technology actually was. Let's go back to something I mentioned in Babylon's Banksters.
Okay.
I think it was around page 251 up through page 254, where I talk about ancient temples as having been constructed to be very simple radio cavity transmitters and receivers, all right?
Mm-hmm.
Well, there's another thing that I mention in Genes, Giants, Monsters, and Men, and this is very, very significant. Many of these temples that appear to have been constructed in that fashion are also resonant to the alpha, beta, and theta brainwaves.
Oh.
So in other words, they were deliberately engineered as technological devices, not only for a very simple long-distance communication, but also as devices to manipulate the consciousness of people inside them and around them, simply by dint of being able to be resonant to those frequencies of the brainwave. And that means, by dint of the case, that means that whoever built them, there was some hidden secret knowledge at work and in play.
Yeah.
And that, of course, means that there's an elite in play.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, oh yeah. So, you know, this is a very, very huge thing that we're talking about. So it's the implications of all of this are just enormous, because it means in turn that many of those ancient classical societies and the religions that they practiced were to a certain extent being manipulated by that elite.
Yes. Oh. Well, is the elite a bloodline?
Oh boy. One of the things I suggest in Genes, Giants, Monsters, and Men is something I first sort of hinted at in the Cosmic War.
Yes.
That these technologies could only be used in close physical proximity to their users.
Oh, yes.
Remember? In
yes.
connection with the Tablets of Destinies. Well, what I am attempting to do in Genes, Giants, Monsters, and Men is sort of pick up from there and go on to explain a little bit more. Now, I hint at the possibility that it may be connected with bloodlines, but to be more accurate, it would be better to say connected perhaps, and please underline and underscore and boldface and italicize the word perhaps, tied to some genome type within human DNA.
Oh.
So, you know, that's a possibility. I'm open to the possibility. But that question would require a lot more research, and it would require genetics coming out and publishing some of their research, and that would be an enormous task to make the correlation. One thing I do point out in Genes, Giants, Monsters, and Men is that there appears to have been some fragmenting of the ancient high science of genetics, and you're not going to believe where part of that fragment went.
Oh, dear.
It went to China.
Oh.
And in fact, it's so famous that people will really be floored when they read what it is that ties directly into genetics.
Oh,
and I'm gonna leave it dangling out there at that. But it's, you know, when I read this and did this research for that book, and came across this, I was just floored.
Oh my goodness!
It takes a little bit to floor me these days.
Yes.
yeah, I was just literally floored. But it's another indicator that we are dealing with the remains of a very, very, very high science that existed in high antiquity, in the mists of human prehistory, and it's just a little more evidence, that what we're dealing with in these high civilizations like Egypt or China or the Vedic civilization in India, that what we're dealing with are legacy civilizations of something much larger and much, much more sophisticated.
Wow.
To say that there's something in ancient China that only resonates with modern genetics.
Yes.
How far, or to say that there are ancient temples that are built to be radio receivers and transmitters that are resonant to certain alpha, beta, and theta brainwave frequencies. Well, on and on we could go, but I think you're getting the picture.
Yeah, with a big spire on top. Oh my goodness, Joe.
Oh yeah, it's rather breathtaking stuff.
Oh, well, yikes.
Yes, yikes is the word.
Oh gosh. I sent you an email about Argentina, some dictators
yes.
that were going on trial
yes.
for a baby racket
yes.
that
yes.
they had going.
Yes.
What are your thoughts on that?
Well, there have been abductions of children all over the world.
Yes.
We've had them in this country. And I must be frank, on two scores, this is a topic that is so abhorrent to me and just so wrenches my heart that I don't really look into it. I haven't looked into it in depth because it's just too it's really just too horrific to contemplate. So my response that I'm about to make is me speculating off the top of my head without much more detail to go on.
Okay.
As to what might be going on here. At the first level, I think you may be dealing with just plain good old-fashioned slavery. That these children are quite literally sold into homes where they are raised more or less to be chattel.
Yes.
In certain areas of the world. But at a deeper level, I have the gut-wrenching suspicion that some of them are quite literally being sold as, so to speak, laboratory rats.
Yes.
For very secretive experimentation that may have something to do with genetics and so on. And the third thing that at the deepest level that I suspect may be going on is that the black elite, so let's call them that, whoever they may be, have been using children in some sort of barbaric revival of black magic practices that would include sacrifice.
Yes.
This is something that I just, even to say something like that, it really disturbs me even to say something like that.
I know.
But I've had to address that issue head on in the book I'm writing now, and I've come to certain very disturbing conclusions about how some people may twist the logic of trying to manipulate the physical medium through that means, and we've spoken before in this series about that.
Yes.
Certainly, if we look at old ancient societies, the Phoenicians, the Carthaginians, the Aztecs, the Mayans, even to a certain extent at one period in very ancient history in India, there was sacrifice. So we have to entertain the dreadful possibility that this practice has been quietly and secretly revived by some very, very evil people.
Very elite people.
And very elite people.
Yes.
I hate saying that, but those are my guesses.
Well, I think you're probably right on.
I hope to God not.
I know. It's horrific.
Yes, it is.
And it's people that engage in those kind of things that we want to believe will wind up in hell.
Well, they are in one already to even contemplate something like that.
Yes.
And for the purposes that sacrifice has usually been practiced. Because you're dealing with, like it or not, you're just dealing with pure, bald, naked black magic in its very worst form. You are trying to coerce and compel a situation or circumstance to occur, whether you want to call it appeasing the gods or whatever. It's just plain black magic, pure and simple, and it's a twisted understanding of the nature of the physical medium and consciousness's relationship to it that leads inevitably in many of those cases to that practice. And like I say, unfortunately, I had to confront that whole thing head on with the book I'm writing now.
Yes. Oh, I know, and it psychologically it's disturbing.
Of course.
It's spiritually disturbing to think that at this day and time those practices would still be going on.
That they might still be going on, yes.
Yeah.
I know, it is. But you see, this is the other disturbing part of it. It means that somebody has come to similar understandings of the nature of the physical medium and of consciousness to it, that all of the old reasons for the practice can be re-advanced or, as far as they're concerned, rationalized again. And that, to me, is the most disturbing part of all of this. That we have not only a return to the ancient sciences, but we have a return to some of the practices associated with them. And I point out, let's remember that one of the highest of those ancient civilizations that had one of the most highly developed understandings of the physical medium and the relationship of consciousness to it was Egypt.
Yes.
And by and large, Egypt did not practice any sort of bloody sacrifice, animal or human. So, again, I stress by and large, but you find in some of the Mesoamerican lore the very clear statement that this was a practice that emerged later, and that it was at the specific instigation of, as far as the Aztec texts are concerned, it was at the specific instigation of what they call sorcerers.
Oh, yes.
So, in other words, even there you have, in a society that actually practiced the hideous thing, that this was something that came later.
Yeah, no, it
and
wasn't.
For very specific reasons, and at the instigation of a very specific group of people.
It wasn't all that long ago.
No, it wasn't. No, it wasn't. It wasn't.
Oh.
And you read the Codex Chimalpopoca, which is the Aztec text. You read that, and you just are brought up short by the sheer scale of it.
Yes.
It's like you're reading a Mesoamerican version of some of the worst things that were practiced by the Nazis. It's just truly horrific in every way that you can possibly imagine it.
Well, getting back to the technology, you said it can be applied to large groups as well as it could pinpoint one person?
Yes. One of the things, I know you've been interviewing Peter Levenda.
Yes. He, by the way, was out of the country, and when he returns, will resume.
Oh, well, good. One of the things that Peter points out in his trilogy, Sinister Forces, which, again, is just a marvelous... it's a marvelous study of the hidden, occult, murky underpinnings of much of American politics. One of the things that he points out is that if you grant the proposition of the existence of this technology, then it becomes possible to re-examine the famous cases of serial killers, the Son of Sam killings, Charles Manson and the whole Manson family, and all of the sickness associated with some of these people. Many of them claim that they've heard voices telling them to do this and that and the other. And again, I don't personally close the door at all on the possibility that maybe these people were being used not only to test some of these technologies, but, so to speak, to kill two birds with one stone, to carry out actual sacrifices in some massive occult ritual that neither they nor their victims really knew that they were a part of. And I think that's kind of the reasoning behind some of Peter's research on it, and I happen to agree with him that this is a distinct possibility.
Well, it sure could be.
Oh yes, I think so. I think he's on to something very major there, and there's no end of the implications to all of this. Not only for society, but politics, for religion, and so on and so forth.
Well, look at the military.
Yes, there's another one.
Yeah.
There's another one.
Yankee Doodle, picket fence, apple pie, and mom.
Well, the other thing, the Yankee Doodle mentality would seek this technology for would be to create essentially the perfect soldier, the perfect killing machine, without normal human scruples. And again, this goes back to some of the early Nazi research in this area. That's precisely what they were after. And all that effort, at least in Nazi Germany, was once again tied to the SS. And quite literally, you had the SS attempting to figure out a way that they could turn off the consciousness or moral sympathies of their own guards and officers in the death camps.
Yes.
Because you can't a normal human being just can't do that to another human being.
That's right.
So this research, it has so many implications, GeorgeAnn, and in my opinion, very little of it's good.
Well, Joseph, that's the part that really bothers me, is where do they get people to do the job of torture, of you know, it just bothers me that there are people out there with that in them.
Yes, yes. Well, you know, the technologies are tied to the techniques, and again, the horrific thing is if you tie this goal to genetic research, you could have a genetic research that is profoundly good, that's trying to isolate the particular portions of the genome that lead to normal, well-adjusted people that don't go around slaughtering each other.
Yeah.
You know? But by the same token, you could be sponsoring research to create a relatively docile population of sheep, and a population of people utterly devoid of moral scruples as overseers and masters. So, you know, that's the horrific possibilities of all this research, and then you combine those possibilities with the actual techniques and technologies of manipulating consciousness directly. It's a rather scary picture.
Yeah, very scary.
Yes, very scary.
Oh, my gosh.
Yeah, it does leave one speechless.
Yes, it does, Joseph. It really and truly does. I know people that believe they've been taken to Mars.
Yes.
There was a U.S. senator, a female, who told me numerous times that she'd been taken to Mars, and they had lunch and la-di-da. And I'd look at her, you know, okay.
Well, this is another thing that I mentioned very specifically in that third chapter of Genes, Giants, Monsters, and Men, because some of the technologies that were developed that I talk specifically about not only can be used to induce visions or revelations, they can also be used to induce out-of-the-body experiences. So in other words, you have in this technology a way of rationalizing two very significant things. You have a way of rationalizing those who have experienced out-of-the-body experiences in association with abductions. You have a way of rationalizing even St. Paul's claim to have been caught up, you know, to the third heaven, and so on and so forth. You have a way, in other words, of saying that these types of experiences can be induced. And the important thing to note here is that when the technology is in play, if you grant that these things are induced, then to the person experiencing them, they are every bit as real as anything you and I experience in a normal daily basis.
Yes.
The problem is their perception of what has happened is what has been tinkered with. That's the key. So, you know, again, you throw open the interpretive possibility for the alien abductees that you know, they've experienced a certain thing that's real, but they're given an interpretation to misunderstand what has happened to them. But if you open up that possibility, then you're also opening up the possibility that similar sorts of things within very famous cases of religious experience could also possibly be the product of a similar technology. That's the rub.
Yes.
Yeah. This is very big. This is very big, and it's not very pleasant. But, you know, the technology, that's my point. The technology is there.
Yes.
And if we grant the proposition that we were dealing in ancient times with legacies of a very high and sophisticated civilization, with a high and sophisticated physics and genetic science, then they most likely also had a very similar sophistication with respect to technologies and techniques of social engineering.
Yes. Yes, it makes sense. Absolutely.
And it makes sense, and it's not pleasant sense.
True. What can I say? Oh my gosh. Oh.
Yeah, it's very, very deep. It's very, very broad in all of its implications, and you know, I'm throwing the implications out there, as I say. It's for other people to figure out in their own personal spiritual life what the implications of all of these things mean for them.
Oh, may we have a moment of silence. Wow, Joseph, this book is going to be...
it's going to set a few people on edge.
Yes. Yes, it will. But I hope it will set them on the edge to think.
Yes, me too. That's the reason I wrote it.
To break the spell, so to speak.
Well, I do too. If it accomplishes anything, I'm hoping that it will wake people up and allow them to begin the process of thinking for themselves.
Yes.
And not having others think for them, no matter who the others may be or when they may have lived.
Yeah.
This is, if we are to mature as a species, and if we are to survive the advent of all of these technologies and many more that are coming at us like locomotives on an express train down the track, if we are to survive, we have to start being spiritually and intellectually mature.
Yes.
And to learn to think through these things and think for ourselves. I certainly don't want anyone to take anything I say as coming from an authority. I'm simply wanting people to think about what I say, and if they disagree with me, disagree.
Yeah.
There's no point in replacing one set of authority figures for another.
That's right.
That's not going to help us. It hasn't helped us thus far, and like I say, the locomotive is coming down the track at breakneck speed.
Yes. Where would they... I can understand the Middle East and the pyramids maybe being reactivated, but where would they have that technology, say, here in the United
North America? In the United States? You mean ancient technology like that?
Yes.
Oh, all around you. All around you. There's a very famous lake in Wisconsin right off the top of my head now. I can't think of it naturally. But under the surface of the lake, there is a little stone pyramid, and there's also a bunch of other stuff on the lake bed that are very clearly the remains of something. There are all sorts of sites like that in the United States. There are megalithic sites, as you know, scattered all over Europe.
Yes.
And certainly in this country as well. Earthenworks and so on, Serpent Mound in Ohio and places like that. They're literally everywhere. In fact, the problem with the book I'm writing now, GeorgeAnn, is there's so much of this stuff. No one person in one book can possibly give an accounting for all of it.
Yes.
I've simply focused on a few cultures and a few of these sites for a particular purpose, to illustrate what I think may have been going on with some of these sites. But, it's all around us here in this country. You're down there in Oklahoma. You're not very far from the Heavener Runestone and all sorts of very strange things in that state. So, it's all over. You just have to open your eyes and look. So what interests me are the more permanent structures that these ancient civilizations built, the pyramids and so on and so forth.
Well, I've wondered what was here. What was here? It seems like Europe and the British Isles were populated. The Middle East was populated, China, Africa, but this country.
Well, that's one of the things I'm talking about in the new book.
Oh, good.
There was something here, and in fact, if you really, really dig hard, you will discover that there was something here a long time ago.
Yes.
And there's quite a bit of evidence to suggest, if you're open-minded enough to look at it, that the old landbridge theory is just, about as nutty as you can possibly be.
Oh, yes.
Because for one thing, if you look at the mitochondrial DNA of many Native American Indian tribes, there's nothing Siberian or Mongolian about them. In fact, in some cases there are more mitochondrial DNA connections between Native American Indians and Europeans than there are with people coming from the Far East. So the land bridge problem is just half the problem. The other half of the problem is that there are human remains and indications of even a degree of civilization in South America that are tens of thousands of years old.
Yes.
And this is the problem, you see, for the standard model. So there was something here, and I think it's interesting, the land bridge theory says that they came across the Bering Strait and then spread from North America down to South America.
Oh, please.
Well, that means you would expect a relatively higher degree of civilization in North America than South America, right?
Right.
Well, the problem is the exact opposite. The further south you go, the more developed it is, and the further north you come, the less developed it is. So, that's another big problem. There's just so many problems like this, and for anyone to assume that they've successfully covered it all, it's just impossible. One thing that I do feel safe in saying is that the standard public academic model, the land bridge model and so on and so forth, and all the associations of historical progress tied with it are just not workable.
Yeah. It's kind of fruitcakey.
Yes, it is. It is.
Well, Joseph, in Mexico, in South America, Central America, we can kind of trace civilizations.
Well, sure.
But here in the United States, what's called the United States, and Canada, there's not so much ancient tracing that we can do, and I mean really ancient.
Well, we can do it if you look at certain things, and if this is my biggest problem with the academic model, and I do get into this a bit in Genes, Giants, Monsters, and Men. If you listen to the Native American Indian lore and legends and traditions, particularly in North America, they will tell you one thing, while the academic model says something entirely different.
Yes. And
I've always been of the opinion that you take these ancient traditions as containing far more truth than the standard model will allow. So, and the point I'm trying to raise there is, if you examine some of the Native American Indian traditions and allow them to speak for themselves, and without the prejudice of that academic model, if you allow those traditions to speak for themselves, they themselves will tell you that there was something else here, and that they found things when they arrived here that were already here.
Yeah.
And this is particularly true. I mean, the biggest whopper of an example of this is Teotihuacan down outside of Mexico City.
Yeah,
There you've got those huge, magnificent pyramids and structures there. And the Aztecs will tell you, well, we came into this valley and they were just here.
Yeah, well.
And in addition to that, they'll also tell you that when they arrived in the Valley of Mexico, those pyramids were overgrown not only with vegetation but covered with earth.
Mm-hmm.
So in other words, that site was very old.
Yes. And
conventional archaeology dates it, to a few hundred years A.D. Well, again, I question the whole standard model here.
Yes.
Because we're not taking the Nahuatl tradition of the Aztecs at its face value. And, they were the ones on the scene more or less first.
Well, when Bishop Landra and Cortez arrived on the Yucatan, and they asked the natives who built these edifices.
And the natives didn't know.
Well, the natives said the Toltecs built them.
Yeah.
And Toltec simply means the builders.
Yeah. So, in other words, they didn't really know.
Right.
Or they had an idea that, the gods built them. Well, again, why do they call the place Teotihuacan? Well, Teo, T-E-O, is very similar to the Greek root theos, which is, again, the Greek for God.
Yes.
And Teotihuacan is literally city of the gods. All right. So in other words, even the word roots are telling us that there's something much, much deeper in play here.
Oh yeah.
Than two distinct cultures, one over in Thrace and Macedonia, and another one over in Mesoamerica. The word roots are themselves telling a little bit of the story. So. Yeah, it's endlessly fascinating, but I don't think we're going to get anywhere by trying to answer these questions from the presumptions of the Standard Model, because the Standard Model, again, is not taking these native traditions seriously enough, in my opinion.
Well, I agree. They don't take the eyewitnesses at their word.
Well, there's that, and there's the presumption of European superiority to the actual people there at the site and their own traditions about these things. And that's another little component of the Standard Model that I'm not too keen about, because the only thing that does is it dismisses a body of evidence that should be examined carefully. Exactly.
Oh, yes, indeed. But you know how it goes. The archaeologists and academics will lose their grant money if they go against the
Standard Model. Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Which brings up the subject of controlling elites, and I even get into in Gene Stein's Monsters and Men, I get into what I call Archaeologygate. The idea that there is a class of evidence within archaeology that is simply deliberately ignored because it goes against the Standard Model.
Yeah.
And the Standard Model has big money behind it. So again, you have a case of an elite that, in a certain sense, is managing perceptions through what appears to be the normal scientific method of objective examination of the evidence, but when you get right down to it, isn't.
Yes. Well, it's the same thing in Israel with the temple. David Seeloff and George Wesley Buchanan did an audio file called The Temple. And there is so much information in that file. For example, there's a ridge, and that is where Zion is. It's not in a temple. It's not, oh my gosh, the Wailing Wall is part of Fort Antonio, and people are praying to it.
Well, there's all sorts of tales and examples of this kind of manipulation of archaeology.
Oh yeah.
This is the other hazard in trying to do research of this sort, because on the one hand you're reliant upon standard archaeology for at least some of your information.
Yes.
But then you have to argue to the contrary to some of its assumptions based on the information it itself uses. This is the problem that alternative research always has. But I think that when you read the types of evidence that I put in Gene Stein's Monsters and Men and consider it in relationship to similar things that I mention in The Cosmic War, that you will see that there has been a definite attempt on the part of mainstream archaeology to concoct what appears to be a plausible reading of human prehistory, but when you examine the anomalous evidence, that attempt or that model, I won't say it completely collapses, but it certainly shot through a lot of holes.
Yeah. Agreed. Oh my gosh. It is so misleading. I mean, history books that they publish in schools.
Yes.
You might as well just throw them out.
Well, we go back to education with that because education is, as we've mentioned before in this series, is the primary means of managing perception. All right? And in an educational system where you are reliant upon a textbook that contains no texts, no primary source reading, this is precisely the end result. You get managed perceptions. And then, in order to create those managed perceptions, you turn it all over, you turn each discipline over to a credentialed elite that speaks for the standard model. So, it's a self-perpetuating veil of misinformation that's being perpetuated.
Yeah.
And thank goodness there's still enough people willing to read and understand and think for themselves outside of preconceived, prepackaged models. I don't care what the model may be in, archaeology, religion, science, what have you. But every one of those things has a standard model, and then there are alternative views.
Yes. Another issue. There's this comet or this thing coming into our solar system. And they are saying that it is under intelligent control.
Well, I don't know anything about that, so I can't comment on it.
Okay.
Sorry.
Oh,
we heard that before with Comet Hale-Bopp.
Yeah.
And I'm always, by the nature of the case, I'm always skeptical.
Yes.
Of claims like that. But beyond that, I don't know anything about what you're talking about, so I can't comment on it. I do know that part of this story of standard model archaeology and so on is also off-world because, if we are to accept the research of people like Mark Carlotto and Richard Hoagland and Errol Torin and people that have been investigating off-world anomalous artifacts,
yes,
then, there's another part of this Archaeologygate that is very, very definitely there, and for want of a better expression, is extraterrestrial archaeology.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah, this spins out in so many ways.
Oh,
but,
yes.
If we take the thesis of the Cosmic War that there was an interplanetary civilization and it blew itself apart in our solar system, then that civilization will have left artifacts hanging around. And given the fact that it was such a long time ago, those artifacts are going to be pretty battered by now.
Yeah.
But there's still going to be the possibility of looking closely at these things and saying, that looks like it may once have been something artificial, and we need to consider that possibility very carefully.
Well, I know Richard Hoagland had a JPEG on his website at one time of, was it Io? One of the moons that looked, you could see square markings on it as if a village or a city had been built there. Plus the idea of it being hollow.
Yes, yes. Well, there's all sorts of those things, and Hoagland's reasoning has always been that nature does not produce regular geometric shapes in redundancy.
Yes, that's what I was trying to say, the geometry of it.
Yeah. And, that to me is the most telling argument that can be advanced for most of this stuff, and that's why I'm willing to entertain the distinct possibility that some of these things are artificial.
Yes.
The most famous example